To make the elegant rondelle necklace, you need bead stringing wire. We're using 19 strand. It's called bright, but really it's a silver color. For beads, we have fire polished faceted rondelles, 5 navy and 4 silver, and they're 8 millimeters by 10 millimeters. We have Miyuki Delica cylinder beads in jet, size 15/0, and we'll tell you more about those later. To finish the ends, we have 2 clamshell bead tips in silver, 2 crimp beads in silver, and a cylinder box clasp, also silver. For tools, we have chain nose pliers and wire cutters. We also have a ruler, and this is optional. We're going to use a bead bug. You could also use masking tape. The first thing we want to do is cut a 20-inch piece of our bead stringing wire, and we did that. And now we're ready to start our beading. And for this design, we are going to put all of our rondelle beads in the center of the necklace. And we have 5 of the navy ones and 4 of the silver ones. So we want to start with the navy ones. And that way they can alternate, because that's our design. So I'm going to slide on our navy one first there, and then a silver one. And we're just going to let those sit right in the middle of the necklace there. Let me move these out of the way. Here we go. Navy one next. These are fire polished rondelles, and we love the fire polish on these because they really give it a lot of sparkle and light. And they end up doing a lot of work to make this very simple design gorgeous and elegant. And we can also, we find these very often. These beads are really common at bead stores and bead shows, and we've even seen them at the flea market. So I've almost got all of the center beads on. You can see how fast this part goes together. Like that. And then that's going to be at the center of our necklace. And I'm just going to put a bead bug, which is this little clamp thing that is optional to use. You could use a piece of masking tape instead if you want. But I'm just going to clamp it onto my bead stringing wire, and that's going to keep the beads from sliding off. And it doesn't matter where you put this because we're going to bead that side later. So now what we want to do is feed on 6 3/4 inches of our Delica seed beads. And we have 2 great tricks for working with these tiny seed beads. I like to work with them in my hand, and so I'm pouring a big clump of them into my hand like that. And then one great way to get seed beads onto your bead stringing wire is to simply take the end of the bead stringing wire and kind of tip the seed bead onto the bead stringing wire, and then you just sort of tip it and it'll slide back down. So that's a way of just sort of getting them on there. You can do a couple at a time if you want, and kind of move the bead stringing wire against your hand and they'll slide a little bit. And that's a way of making quick work out of what could be a really tedious process of feeding on several inches of these tiny seed beads, but it's worth it because they end up looking great. So that's tipping them onto the bead stringing wire. We call that bead handling. It's like a bead handling trick. The other thing I like to do is fish for the seed beads. And a way to do that is to simply take the bead stringing wire and kind of push it through the pile of the seed beads. And you see they end up getting on the bead stringing wire. And it works a little bit more efficiently with round seed beads. These are Delica, Miyuki Delica seed beads, and so they're cut in a cylinder shape. They're not rounded at the ends. They're straight cut. And because of that straight cut, I think not as many want to jump on my bead stringing wires when they're rounded, but you get some on there that way. So I'm just going to slide those down, and I'm just going to keep feeding seed beads onto my bead stringing wire here until I have 6 3/4 inches on this one side, and then we'll be ready to do the other side. So we just have a couple more to feed on here, and then I want to see if I've got enough of our cylinder beads on here. Slide those down. I'm going to put these back in my little cup and lay that out and then measure. So that looks like I've got 6 3/4 inches on there. Awesome. So now what I'm going to do is hold on to this end so those beads don't slide off. Grab where I've got my bead bug, and I'm going to move the bead bug to the other side. Make sure it's on there nice and tight, and start sliding the cylinder beads onto the other side. And I'm going to use the same technique I used before. The one that was working best for me was tipping the cylinder seed beads onto the bead stringing wire. So I'm going to keep doing that. And then I'm just going to keep feeding these cylinder seed beads onto the bead stringing wire and measuring until I have 6 3/4 inches on this side, and then we'll show you how to finish the ends. We finished beading the other side of our necklace and we're ready to finish the ends. And to do that, the first thing we want to do is take one of our clamshell bead tips, and we want to feed the bead stringing wire up through the bottom of the clamshell bead tip. This clamshell bead tip is basically like a little cup. At the bottom there's a little hole, and then there's a clam shape, like clamshell shape. So we feed the bead stringing wire up through the bottom of the clamshell. So next we'll feed on our crimp bead, just like that. And we're going to slide the crimp bead down about 1.5 inches, and that's just so we have enough room to work with here. And I'm going to flatten the crimp bead using my chain nose pliers. And crimp beads are meant to be flattened. That's the idea. They come in crimp beads or crimp tubes, and it's basically a bead or tube made of soft metal that you can then flatten, and then it won't move. It'll stay right where you flatten it. And I'm going to go ahead and trim that right next to that where my crimp bead is crimped. And now what I want to do is slide that clamshell bead tip up so that the seed bead or the crimp bead is nice and cupped in my little clamshell bead tip. And then what I'm going to do is use my chain nose pliers again and just press that clamshell closed. You don't have to press very hard. It'll close just fine on its own like that with just a little bit of pressure. So now that crimp bead is hidden in the little clamshell. I'm going to take one side of my clasp. I went ahead and took the clasp apart, and it's got a little loop on the end, and I'm going to just feed that on this open loop of my clamshell bead tip. These come with an open loop or closed loop, and we chose an open loop for this project because it makes it really easy to put the clasp on. And I'm just using my chain nose pliers to rotate that loop closed like that. I want to make sure it's nice and closed so that my clasp doesn't come off. And there, one side is done. And what we want to do to finish the other side is start by sliding all the beads down to the other end so that they're nice and tight up against the clasp that we just put on. So I slid those down. I want to make sure there's no slack in there. So I'm going to use my thumb and forefinger to hold the beads in place on my bead stringing wire so that there isn't any slack. Take my bead bug off, and I'm going to do the same thing to finish this side of the necklace. I've got my clamshell bead tip. I'm going to feed the bead stringing wire up through the bottom of my clamshell bead tip like that. Slide on my crimp bead, and this time I need the crimp bead to be down inside my clamshell bead tip right next to the beads because we don't want the beads to move around too much on the necklace. We don't want any of that bead stringing wire to show. So I'm going to make sure that that clamshell bead tip is down up against the beads nice and tight. Not too tight. You want a little bit of wiggle room, but not so much that the beads jostle around. And I'm going to hold that in my fingers like that. Use my chain nose pliers again to reach in and flatten that crimp bead on the bead stringing wire. Make sure it's nice and crimped. And you can test that a little bit by making sure that the clamshell bead tip doesn't move, and so I can tell that it's, I'm going to give it one more press actually. There we go. Then I'm going to use my wire cutters to cut the wire right above that crimp bead, like that. And then I'm going to use my chain nose pliers again to close my clamshell on the clamshell bead tip, like that. Take the other end of my clasp and feed this through the loop on the clamshell bead tip, and then use my chain nose pliers again to rotate that little loop down and close it. And I'll close our little clasp here. And there we have our beautiful, elegant rondelle necklace.